So I'd like to talk tonight about secularism and multiculturalism, but really via talking about the nature of secularism. That's maybe the best way to cut into it. And I'd like to offer some definitions of secularism which have been presented. And here again, we're going to see that what I'm saying is the beneficiary, the result of earlier collaborations, because when I talked about the spaces of reflection, I've been in some. I haven't been in any that really have been located in universities. I've been in one in the last 25 or more years, which was located between universities and disciplines. We were kind of wandering around. Some of you are here today who've been in this. But the most valuable thinking has been done there. I mean, it's very exciting to think that actually it can survive inside a university, and I wish you the best of luck in that. But what I want to say here emerges from exactly that kind of experience, exactly the kind of experience you're starting here. So let me start off by saying it seems to me that there are two notions of secularism that are going the rounds today internationally, because this is a problem that arises almost everywhere. And when I say secularism, I mean also what in the French zone we call laïcité. These aren't exactly the same, they don't translate exactly, but they have similar problems and a great deal of problems in common. Well, the first of these is the one that perhaps comes to mind most often in history. It's a notion of secularism or laïcité as concerned with putting religion in its place. The understanding being that religion or religious associations or churches have had too much space, and there's some truth in that, right? Have had too much space in the past and they have to be confined. So it's concerned with finding a way of confining religion and religious institutions, preventing them from, as it were, bursting out and controlling or having influence where they shouldn't. The second concept is very different. It starts from a completely different idea of what we need, and it's a reaction to diversity, to tremendous diversity in religious outlook, spiritual outlook, including anti-religious, anti-spiritual, basic views of the world, basic conceptions of what the source of the good are. In a society in which these very diverse views are held, how do you bring people together in a way which is both just, fair, and possibly harmonious? So that's another kind of secularism, laïcité, which starts from a different set of problems. Now, I don't hide the fact that I am totally partisan here. I mean, I'm very much for the second view. But I think it's worth exploring the way these have worked out and the way the argument between them has arisen. And there, of course, here I'm taking a leaf from Jennifer Newman, and we will have to do this. I'm coming from somewhere, I'm going somewhere. I'm coming from, of course, Canada, but also especially here at Quebec. And that means that we're connected in a certain way to the French debate, which has somehow spilled over into our debate. So that's been my background. And let me just say one more thing about the situation of this talk in my whole development. I've learned a tremendous amount from being able to discuss these issues with people from very different experiences, and I go on learning. So this is part of my learning process of moving beyond my own very narrow background and seeing these problems in a much broader light. Okay, well, let's look at these two. Let's call them the religion controlling and the diversity oriented views, right? Let's look at these two and see how they differ. Well, one way that they differ is that the tendency among the religion controlling view is to think that there's a single problem, controlling religion, keeping it in its place, and it has a single answer. And you somehow get the right answer, and that's it, that's settled for all time. But the other view turns out to be much more complex. And here I'm articulating, here as an example of how this has come out of previous discussions, I'm articulating a view of that second conception, which has been fed by the experience of India, long discussions with Rajiv Berggruen, with other parts of the country, with other, other sources. And it goes something like this. The diversity-oriented view recognizes that there are a plurality of goals, and you have to somehow balance them. And the two main ones, to simplify things very quickly, are there has to be a government, institutions, a society which officially is even-handed. You might say neutral, but certainly even-handed between very different religious and non-religious views, on one hand. So this neutrality or even-handedness is very important. On the other hand, its second goal is the maximum, well, as we described it in our commission, I'm building on that, freedom of conscience, right? The freedom of people to practice the spirituality, the religion, the non-religion that they really want to. The minimum restriction possible. So, I mean, I could add further goals, and I would. I mean, I think it's a great goal of society to try to bring all these families together and allow them to exchange with each other. But let's take those two. Right away you see that that kind of conception allows for, indeed, makes show up dilemmas. Right? The demands of one start to get into tension with the demands of the other. Whereas the first one seems to be saying there's a single problem and this is the best answer to that problem. And so we can just proceed with that. Once you admit dilemmas, then also a lot of other things come in, because you begin to be clear that the best resolution of these dilemmas or these possible conflicts is going to be different here than there. It's going to be different then than now. So you have to rethink constantly what it's all about. I mean, let me give an example which of course was central to our commission in Quebec, which is naturally the problem of religious signs. I mean, that is people who wear various kinds of clothing that represents their having a certain religious view, and the attempt of a certain kind of laïcité, the one that was proposed to us in Quebec, but really copied from the one that started to advance in France about a decade ago with the Loi Stasi and the Commission Stasi and so on, was very, very hostile, wanted to restrict the wearing of these signs. So an absolutely crucial concept here, underlying the first demand, the demand of neutrality, was centered around a concept of space. Chirac talked about les espaces de la République, the spaces of the Republic, right? So you have certain spaces like the public service, like the institutions that are funded by the state and so on. And in these spaces you have to observe neutrality, and that means restricting the wearing of religious signs. But of course, that is a definition of neutrality which is tremendously imposing on, restrictive of freedom of conscience. It means that people whose conscience requires them to wear a turban as Sikhs, or a hijab as Muslims, or a kippah as observant Jew are just going to be excluded from certain professions altogether. I mean, in the case of a modern society like Quebec, the public sector, including all the schools and hospitals funded by the public sector, is just a massive segment of the possible employment. Right? It also means that over time, I mean, that particular proposal maybe was much less damaging to religious freedom and freedom of conscience in 1905 France, but when we think of the growth of the public sector in all modern democracies, the burden that it imposes on people is going to grow and grow. See? So once you see there are two goals here, then you ask yourself, well, maybe is there another way of defining religious neutrality or defining even-handedness, which doesn't have this tremendous impact on the other goal? So I think that, I mean, I'm obviously making a plea for this, and I think rightly so. There's another thing about the religion controlling view, which worries me a little bit, is that if I look at the French debate, was deeply impressed by the fact that it was all looking back to founding moment, right? Laïcité is part of our tradition, right? It was almost une laïcité identitaire, almost a laïcité, a secularism of identity. It was kind of a little contradiction here. But the idea was that somehow, at some earlier moment, something was laid down, really fundamental, right? And we have to go on following it. Whereas the other view, obviously, the other notion that there are, let's say, two principles and we have to balance them, is an invitation regularly to rethink. Yeah, that was maybe a good idea back there, but is that a good idea today? Right, so obviously there are real problems with this. Let me just say a quick word about the history of these two before I go on to an attempt to explain why not everybody agrees with me immediately that the diversity-oriented one is the proper formula for today. But before that, let me say quickly that people tend to think that historically these correspond to the two great, as it were, moments of innovation in this field in the West, the American Constitution formation with the First Amendment and the French Revolution. Yes, in one sense, the American Constitution formation was obviously thinking diversity, right? They were thinking, you know, they had to pass the amendment not because they had a lot of very great religious neutrality in the states at the time. On the contrary, they had established churches in a lot of the states, but they were different established churches, and they wanted to make sure the federal government didn't come down on the side of one and the other. So it says Congress shall pass no law establishing church, right? So they were diversity-oriented from the beginning. And in the French case, they were both in the Republic, in the original Revolution, and in the foundation of the Third Republic. They were really fighting a very hegemonically claiming church. I mean, it would be trying to, in many cases, reestablish the monarchy. So these certainly are the origin points. But both of these traditions, very important to point this out, have become much more mixed. See? In the American case, they were thinking about diversity, but it was all Protestant sects, right? So then along come Catholics, a very worrying phenomenon, of Irish in the 1840s, along come Jews, along come, et cetera, et cetera. And then there was an attempt, there was a story, the famous American jurist in the 1820s said, okay, we have many churches here, but this is a Christian country, so let's make clear that this is a Christian country. And there was an attempt to put a constitutional amendment in the 19th century to that effect. And there was a big fight about that. Incidentally, that's when the word secular begins to enter the US debate. So the Americans have been occupying both these spaces, both these definitions at different points. And now, in a certain sense, they're, the way the very angry debate is going on in the United States, you almost think of them in the religion controlling area. And by parity, as it were, in the French case, in 1904 or 5, there were a number of very different tendencies. And along with the Berggruen, who had this very restrictive view, you have people like Jean Jaurès who really believed in spiritual freedom and so on and wanted to emphasize freedom of conscience. So just to point out that these two are not simply aligned with the French and the American experience. Okay, so let me go on from here to try to understand what is going on. Now, it just seems obvious to me that in the present situation, the formula we ought to be thinking about is the diversity-oriented formula. Why? Well, obvious reason. Our societies, I mean, on one hand, a positive reason, on the other hand, a negative fact. The negative fact is that in most Western societies, we don't have a vast hegemonic institution that is threatening to take over. We have a tremendous, I mean, much weaker religious institutions than, politically speaking, than were in the past, and much more diverse. But the second positive fact is that our societies are just immensely more diverse. And now partly this is the result of migration, in Canada. We're familiar since way back, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, but to speak of, we had almost no Buddhists, no Hindus, no Muslims, and so on. When I was a child, that's a long time ago, but even more recently. And that has changed. Migration has changed that. But we mustn't simply focus on migration. We've had a kind of cultural revolution in Western societies associated with what I'd like to call the ethic of authenticity, people seeking their own identity and so on, which has meant that among populations that didn't originate by migration at all, populations that have been there with ancestors for as long as you like, a movement like feminism, a movement like gay rights, a movement like recovering a sense of regional identity here, a movement like in places like France, recovering the regional identities which were suppressed by the Third Republic. All these things are occurring among, if you like, indigenous, not in the usual, not in the sense of indigenous before Europeans arrived, but in populations that have been there for a long time. And also, this is very true, of the relative impossibility now of denying the identity and the importance of what we very often call indigenous peoples, in Canadian parlance, the First Nations. It's just become the whole atmosphere. It makes it harder and harder. Now, I'm not saying there's not a lot of resistance there still is, but it's harder and harder for people simply to say, forget this. So you can see that there's been a cultural revolution, if I can put it this way, in our societies, which makes diversity a much more salient fact. Now, why? Now I'm coming to the hard part. I don't mean hard in the sense of working it out, but the part that is painful to look at. Why there's so much resistance to that? Why, in spite of that, in France, in Quebec, in many European societies, do we find societies turning against minorities, turning against immigrants, and seeking some kind of exclusion, and justifying this in terms of laïcité or secularism, but of the kind which definitely is concerned with controlling the place of religion. What is it? Well, there are various kinds of hangovers that are going on from the past, and let's look at these quickly because they're obvious, but they don't answer the whole question. I mean, let's take Quebec. I mean, we have terrible experience of hegemonic church up until about 1960, really bad experience. I mean, in a sense, it's not that it's ridiculous to say that the church oppressed us. It was us, Québécois, whose sense of identity was so bound up with the Catholic Church that we oppressed ourselves, we oppressed each other. It became very difficult to stand out and not conform and so on. But in any case, it was a very bad experience. And when people broke from this, that generation of the baby boomers, they really are in some ways, I shouldn't say that, I mean, almost unhinged in their hostility. I shouldn't say that. But I mean, their kids sometimes say, why is Dad going on and on about this? And I understand why Dad is going on and on. He had really bad experience and so on, but that leaves a mark, right? So you can still get people who want to float something like the Charter of Secularism, the Charte de la laïcité. They refer to this experience and they get a lot of support, And even the kids sometimes go along. I remember one of my grandchildren had a conversation with somebody recently about the Charte de la laïcité, and this kid her age said, I agree with that. I said, but my granddaughter said, but look, you're wearing tattoos. Okay? What happens if the people you employ you say, well, I don't know, really good idea, but why are you for this? Mon père m'a dit que that somehow it carries on with the next generation. Okay, that's one thing. Another thing is we have in our cultural DNA in the West a deep sense that in societies, in order to stand together, to cohere, need some very powerful ethical glue and so on. I think this is true even more of democratic societies, as I'll come to in a minute, than of more authoritarian societies. And we took for granted for not just decades, for not generations, centuries, we took for granted in European culture that the agreement had to be not only on, let's say, the rules of the game in politics, the agreement had to go right down to the very basic sources of ethics, which were thought to be, of course, religious. So the idea that there could be a society that would function, that was religiously plural, was very, very shaky and scary, right? So the various attempts were made at the time of the Reformation to try on some, agreements of tolerance, edit de Nantes, etc., but these were always very, very fragile. And if a lot of people believe that you can't have a plural society that is stable, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. That is because governments will say, "Oh, these guys they're not threatening us now, but they will later on, so we better see." And so we got something like the Edit de Nantes, the Edict of Nantes in France, with a kind of deal giving certain zones to the Huguenots, was finally revoked. So that is something very, very deep. And why I'm saying this is deep? Well, because I find this argument coming up again and again with people when I argue for the kind of secularism that I'm in favor of. They say, well, what we need is kind of unity. And as a matter of fact, it's even more the case with democratic societies. I would think you could argue that democratic societies need a very strong sense of bonding around a certain ethic, political ethic, but more than that, they need it around the particular project of realizing this ethic which their society represents. The Quebec attempt, the Canadian attempt, the Australian attempt, the French attempt, and so on. To realize this ethic, which our ethic is now, turns around democracy, human rights, non-discrimination, and so on. And without that, we lack very important, as it were, tools or motivations to keep our society going, to keep people doing what they ought to do, participating in the way they ought to participate without being forced to by somebody with a big gun behind them. But more than that, to create these links of solidarity, see, where we're willing to come to the aid of people because they are concitoyens, compatriots, right? And without that, we're losing something very important. Now this, you could call this patriotism, this sense of attachment, not just to the general principles, yes, those too, but to our particular attempt to realize them. And you can see how powerful this is, extra motivation is. That is, I, like all of you, we rejoice when some other country, with Burma is now moving, we hope, with Aung San Suu Kyi towards democracy and human rights, and something in us rejoices. But when it comes to being our own country in question, it's something like pride or shame, lots of that these days, right, comes into effect. It's a very powerful motivation. As a Canadian, I was the last government, I won't go on and on about them, that we just kicked out. It's a deeply shaming experience. I traveled around the world. You're Canadian. Let's not talk about it. They used to say, "Oh, you're great, you Canadians." But now the silence falls. You feel shame, right? So this is a very important motivation for our liberal democratic societies. Now, if you think that that has to go that unity around the political ethic has to go all the way down, then we're back again in this difficulty in admitting that there could be many such views. In a sense, you could say that one of the great constructions of modern liberal society has been the construction of a society not around no political ethic, not around no principles, but around this set of political principles I've just been mentioning, equality, democracy, human rights, where people sign on for very different reasons. I think this is the great, one of the great inventions of John Rawls's theory, the idea of an overlapping consensus. We're all for the right to life. See, as a Christian, we'll talk about image of God. A Kantian will talk about the human rational agent being deserving, having dignity and deserving. A utilitarian will talk about, well, these people can suffer and can have joy and so on, so that we have to, as it were, take that into account, and that's the basic reason for treating them. They're not just like stones or anything else, right? So we have here very, very different background reasons converging. And this it's hard. It's particularly hard for us because of our long tradition in Christendom. You know, we're taking for granted that everything comes from a single source. I contrast this, discussions I've had with Rajiv and stuff, contrast this to the civilization in India at the time of Ashoka, so where it's just obvious that there's just tons of different projects and forms of spirituality around, and you can't, I mean, the idea of forcing them all into one, cramming them all into one house and so on, just couldn't occur to people. Now, that goes along with certain problems. It's very interesting to go into this. The political doesn't have the same ethical status in Hindu civilization as it does in our Greek plus civilization. Yeah, but, okay, this gains and losses, but just have that as a comparison point, and one can see that there's something very, very different here. And so we have trouble, although we're developing a world in which our different religious and spiritual positions are lived in the same degree of plurality as existed since longer in India, as exists in many parts of the third world and so on. We are slowly adapting ourselves to that, and it's not an easy question, not an easy move. All right, but so these are some reasons why people don't jump right away towards the diversity-oriented model. But even though it seems to me totally clear that that's the model that will work for us and no other model will. Okay, but there are more reasons, and now I want to go into the reasons that are more painful, more hidden, more problematic. You see, one of them is this. I've talked about our need for being bonded around a project of a certain political ethic, and our need to be proud of this and our particular project and so on. And so let's call this a political identity. Our political identity is this identity of the whole society. They're formed on one hand of this ethical dimension, and on the other hand of a certain consciousness that we're in a particular historical attempt to realize them, right? So being in the stream of history of Canada or of Quebec, but also having these principles, it forms together my political identity. Now we haven't examined this enough, I think, but in this feature of democracies, which is their strength, their unity and their solidarity, there hides a danger. The danger is that you slide towards a conception of what binds you together, which somehow makes these people appear, well, they don't really belong here, right? This can be, of course, ethnically driven. There's some other ethnic group than the one that has dominated this particular project. But it can also be ethically driven. They're not really living up to the ethic. Or, much more commonly, it can be the first rationalized by the second. I mean, let's go back to the Irish in the US. And this is safe because it's a problem in another country a long time ago, and they've kind of got over it in the United States, this particular one. Okay, so the Irish, all these papists suddenly come on the shore of our Protestant republic, and they don't have the right mores and so on. And so the Know Nothing Party wanted to deny them citizenship, etc. It's all quite understandable, but it involved a heavy degree of rationalization. I mean, cultural discomfort was one of the motivators, but the thing had to be justified in higher, more universal principles. Now, I'm citing that because you can get over it, and they've got over that one. I mean, other things they haven't got over in the States, but they've got over that one. So it's not the end of the world. You can actually beat it in the long run, right? The initial shock of being so different, if you keep your nerves, you keep your sense of what the important principles are, you can learn to live through it. And after a while, people get integrated, they work with others, they get to know each other, and this can be overcome. But this kind of targeting of minorities or groups is almost writ into the possibilities involved in a political identity. If it's something very important and it's ours and we reprise it, and then we find that certain people make us very uncomfortable in that very identity, then we're tempted to pull this step, make this step. And that's what I see happening right around me in Quebec these decades. Yes, we were used to people with certain religious practices, Catholics, Protestants, Jews, and then suddenly all these other people came along. And we were also a little bit used, because of the Quiet Revolution and what I talked about, the secularization of Quebec, we were used to religion being kind of very, let's say, discreet, consenting adults and off somewhere in a church. But then this stuff is very in your face. So there's a tendency to think, well, they're doing it to get our goat. I mean, you should hear this all the time. Why is she wearing that scarf? It must be because they want us all to make a statement. Your principles are no good. Again, I could refer to the Stasi, the debate in France around the Stasi law, and people were saying, there's a very interesting French expression, signe ostentatoire, right? A very obvious sign. Those are the things that are always forbidden. But ostentatoire in the French used in that debate has another ring. I would translate it as in your face, right? So the assumption is they're doing it to get us, or they're doing it because they're somehow resisting us, or they're somehow criticizing us. And very often these people who just were practicing their religion, no, I don't want to do that. Ce n'est pas un signe, ce n'est pas un signe. They would say, but they weren't listened to. So you get these understandable but very crucially dangerous reactions where a cultural discomfort, which can't be denied, which is there, the fear that they're going to change us after a while and so on, is translated into these moves for exclusion, which are precisely made powerful by being moralized. You see, it's not just that they make me uncomfortable. No one's going to say, oh, she makes you very uncomfortable, I wish she'd go away, and so on. So therefore, let's pass a law. No, you can't do that, right? You can't do that. But what you can do is, her wanting to wear that headscarf, I mean, it represents a denial of feminism and denial of what we've been fighting for, and so on. Then you have what looks like a kosher reason. Now, here's where we have, unfortunately, one of the driving forces behind this notion of laïcité. That we're paying the price for having very high principles and for having very good principles of non-exclusion, that when you really want to exclude somebody, you've got to think of a good reason. The reason's got to be moral, it's got to be in principle. So, you can't just look at this as a cultural custom. You've got to look at this as a religious statement, which is dangerous. Right? So, and if you actually look at the lived experience, this kind of gets totally artificial. I mean, there's a Sikh doctor I knew that was going to be thrown out of the hospital and so on, which didn't pass, right? But in this case, he's not. What is he? I mean, look, my father did this, my grandfather did this, this is what we do. I mean, it wasn't necessarily making a heavy theological statement about anything. It was just I mean, it wasn't not making a theological statement. It's so mixed up that if you said, you've got to decide, are you doing this for religious reasons or for cultural reasons, it would be impossible. Now, so this very complex reality is being coded in a certain way because it can be dealt with in that way by people who want to give expression to their cultural discomfort, right? And so the debate is being pushed in a direction. Also, from the other side too, if I want to go on wearing this and I'm getting flack, well, instead of, I just feel like wearing this, so get off my back. No. I have a right to wear this because it says in the charter, I mean, this is the real charter, the charter that's in the Canadian Charter, Quebec Charter of Rights, you can't discriminate on grounds of religious belief. So in a way, the situation is very often escalated into a war of religion, as it were, around these issues. The possibility of just calming down, it makes me uncomfortable, but maybe we can live with this and so on, gets cut off. You see that we get driven towards stereotypical thinking and scapegoating. You know, we had in the last election the most egregious form of scapegoating around the niqab. Right? By scapegoating, I mean that it's when people feel uncomfortable about something in their society and they find a way of dealing with it by saying, well, it's all comes from them, so let's get rid of them or put them in a box somewhere, and that's the classic scapegoating. I mean, I said to some of my very laïc friends at some point, which was a strategic mistake, you know, you guys are against religion. If you want to know, one of the oldest religious customs of a very negative kind is called scapegoating, and that's what you guys are doing. So don't tell me that you're getting rid of anyway. That argument didn't seem to convince me. But so this is generated out of the situation, right? And it can get to a point. It's got to a point now where it's really something which is life-threatening for our democracy. I'd like to go on to that for a minute because I'm talking about the Western democracies that I'm familiar with in Europe and in North America. Why? Well, because there's a very important feature in democracies. I'd like to introduce some more stuff here. I'm sorry to overload you, but modern democracy is a very peculiar thing because it's ruled by the people, right? But the people have, the word the people has two meanings. And they both enter into the definition. One meaning is the ensemble of human beings that belong to this community, right? So ruled by the people would be that the ensemble somehow decides. And if you have universal suffrage, it looks like, okay, that's fine. I mean, that's democracy. Another sense of the people is the one we get from the Greek demos, right? Which means the non-elite people, the ordinary people, common people, plebs in Roman, right? As against Laos, as against populace, right? It's the people in that sense of the non-elites. And I want to make a claim, just shot out of a pistol like that, we can argue about it later, that our modern democracy involves a complex invocation of these two senses. It must minimally be the rule by the people in the first sense, but it ought properly to be, not exactly the rule only of the demos, I mean that's Aristotle thought is democracy and he didn't like it, but it's got to be one in which the demos, the non-elites, have their proportional role as against being, it very often happens, shunted aside and more or less their input being diminished. I think what we are actually operating with in our world, I would call it a telic concept of democracy. That is, the goal is, the rule by the people in the first sense ought to become ruled by all the people in which the demos has its proper place, and we're never quite there. We're always going forward and going backward, and I would argue we've been going in both directions since about 1975 in the West, anyway the North. Maybe you're a lucky society here I'm talking to, but we've been going backwards away from that. There's been less input, more power of money, and so on. So you get democratic reaction. And it's a feature of democracies that there's a kind of excitement and sense of participation, and people want to vote and so on when they feel it's moving in the right direction, and a sense of low morale, turning off, lower voting levels when we feel we're moving in the wrong direction. Now, that democratic reflex or instinct is now being captured by an alternative form, right? It's not, as it always has been, simply the socioeconomic non-elites who are being not given their proper input, there's too much power of money and so on. We now have an alternative version of that, which is the cultural liberal elites are forcing us to accept all these other people and all these principles of immigrants or not passing laws to restrict what these people who are sort of negative as far as our way of life is concerned are carrying out. And you can see this happening now in an almost tragic way in France. I mean, you read Gilles Kepel and his La Terreur dans l'Hexagone, you want to weep. You know, the young Muslims, young Algerians, who got citizenship because they were born there. Their parents didn't have it because they weren't given it, but they got it because they were born there. A lot of them started to vote in the late 2000s. And in 2012, they voted massively for Hollande. Of course, against Sarkozy, because he had mobilized his whole candidacy to the presidency by precisely targeting them. And they had the hope that their situation, not having jobs, not being trained and so on, would somehow improve. But under the socialist government, partly because of the European austerity, that didn't happen. And now one finds that among a lot of those people, they are also subject to a kind of identity mobilization as Muslims against France. This is not yet terrorism. It's not the base of terrorism. It can be Salafist, it can be various kinds of Wahhabi, so on. But it's, of course, the climate in which some people can flip over. I think the minority that flip over is very, very small, and we have to have the right understanding. If people with real identity problems, it's, you know, people criminal and so on. But nevertheless, it's a tragedy that in France you now have these two demos populations, the native French underprivileged who are being mobilized by Marine Le Pen against these outsiders, and then these Muslims that are being mobilized to reject. Now, it hasn't necessarily gone to the point of no return, but you can see how this is really a danger to our entire democratic experiment. And of course, can I not talk about the United States? I mean, with fascination, repulsion, and fear, you see on one hand, not in this case with repulsion at all, and not with fear, but you see the mobilization of Bernie Sanders, right? The traditional mobilization of the political left around the excessive privilege, the power of money, and how to overcome that. And on the other hand, you have, I won't mention the name, you know what I mean. And who is mobilizing around, we're against another kind of elites, these elites of political correctness, these liberal, latte-sipping Northeastern liberals, etc. And this is, needless to say, could be totally disastrous for the future of our democracy. So what does it depend on? Well, I think, and what does the outcome depend on? Well, it depends partly on, and I think I'll come back to Jennifer again, it depends on the narrative that we accept. See, I mentioned earlier that the wrong kind of secularism is very often based on what I consider a bad kind of narrative. The narrative of we all started off with our pure principles and so on, and we've fallen away from them, but we got to go back to them. So we have to get to the original institutions, right, or the original provisions, and that'll be our salvation, a little bit like the Tea Party in the United States, right? It's since 1774, and all Boston Harbor has been downhill all the way, but we can bring it back. The other is another kind of narrative entirely, the narrative that we started off something really very good, but it had huge problems, huge faults, right? It had huge faults in the way we excluded Aboriginals. It had huge faults in the American case with slavery. It had huge faults in the way we excluded Chinese in the West, and Canada and so on. But we want to push forward in this direction, and we think we can push forward in this direction. So the whole sense of the narrative is pointed in another direction. I mean, first of all, this makes it possible to acknowledge the terrible things that we've done without losing our morale, without losing our sense of identity, without losing our sense of really common bonding around this. But secondly, it allows us to include new people. And you see, that's really what multiculturalism means in Canada, what anti-culturalism means in Quebec. The crucial thing is no human individual can exist as a person without a personal narrative. And no society can exist and cohere and continue without a narrative of the collective, of the society. So what we have today is a kind of battle of the narratives, a battle between a narrative which points to some kind of purity and excellence and being entirely okay somewhere there in the past, and we're losing it, and all these other people are coming here and they're going to change us and they're going to make us lose it, or a narrative of, we have this vector, which is really very admirable. It's been a vector towards including more people, towards more democracy, towards recognizing more rights, and we've got to continue on this vector. And the big issue is, how excited can you get people, especially young people, with this narrative? On that, in a way, is going to depend the future of our societies, the future of our democracy, the continued civilized mode of existence that we've been used to in our society, and to the extent that it exists. It's going to be the battle of those two narratives that are going to decide this. So I've come maybe a long way, but I've tried to present with this prism of the wrong view of secularism being so powerful, with that prism, trying to understand why, we can see the forces in our culture that are pushing us in a very bad direction, and the way we can potentially defeat them. So thank you very much for your very, very kind attention.